I wanted to certainly give you a sense of the journey that Dante undertakes as a whole, but to think about it particularly in terms of how his perception of things changes through the realms of the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. I think that is the key to understanding the Divine Comedy as a guide for us now. You know, Dante wrote in the early Renaissance period. He's the first Italian to use the word modern. And so he's definitely thinking about future generations, I think, including us. And one of the reasons that the Divine Comedy is one of these texts that once you find a way in, it just keeps on giving, is that it works on you. It invites you to new perceptions of reality on this side of the grave as much as on the other side of death. And so to try and give you, well, I hope a good sense of that, quite a practical sense this evening even, of that transformation by considering some of the key moments and the key themes that Dante himself finds transformation through on his journey. So look, just to orientate things before I get going on that, here are a couple of well-known pictures that describe the whole journey of the Divine Comedy. The famous picture from the Duomo in Florence with Dante holding the book and pointing to the Inferno where it begins, up through Mount Purgatory, and then into the celestial heavens in the third part of the Paradise. It's more schematically shown there on the right. And just by way of an example of how I'm going to try and talk about this evening, take how his experience of time shifts through these three domains. When he enters hell at the beginning of his journey, time is a preoccupation with the past and with the future. The souls he meets who are tormented are either completely fixated on the past or preoccupied with the future. And that means they can't change. There's no now in the Inferno. So it gives you a good indication. Dante shows us what keeps people in hellish states. That's, I think, the way that he fundamentally understands the Inferno. There's no now. And of course, change only happens in the now, not in the past or in the future. And so people, so long as they don't experience time in the present, remain stuck. That begins to change in the Purgatory. It's, for example, the one domain where day and night are experienced. And so the passage of time is known. So the now starts to become a possibility through the movement of time, through the experience of not being stuck. And so Purgatory is a key part of Dante's transformation because his perception of time is different. And then when we come into the Paradise, time is different again. It's the eternal now, where time now is experienced as the possibility of traveling through eternity. The mind, Dante's perceptual capacities increasingly become capable of moving completely freely across the whole of reality. And so he's not constrained by time as he is in Purgatory through the day and the night. He's now freely able to move across time, through time, under time, over time, in eternity. So that's, I hope, just a one beginning sort of sense, an example of how we can think about the Divine Comedy as introducing us to different perceptual possibilities. And because Dante describes his journey, the characters he meets, the poetry, the beauty reflected in the wonderful illustrations that the Divine Comedy quickly inspired, that can invite us to undergo perceptual change as well. And so follow him on his journey and make that journey our own, from stuck infernal states through changing purgatorial states into timeless states where we're free to know reality unalloyed. So what I thought I'd do is break these three moments down into half a dozen or so other areas and consider a bit more depth now how he meets people along the way, so that we also get a sense of the journey itself, culminating as you heard there in the vision of moving like a perfect wheel with the love that turns the sun and the other stars right at the end, and what that might be about. I thought I could look at how love changes for him, the experience of love, how the experience of suffering changes for him, how the experience of seeking changes for him, how the experience of telepathy changes for him, because the Divine Comedy is theological, poetic, but it's also very interested in what we would now call the supernatural too, and so he mustn't lose touch with that. And then finally coming to what he calls transhumanizing, a word that is used very frequently now in a very different sense to Dante, who was the first person to use the word transhumanizing. It's another one of his coinages. So looking at love, seeking, suffering, telepathy, and transhumanizing. This explains why he must go on this great journey. Just a touch on the beginning. He wakes in the dark woods midway through the course of our life, having wandered from the way. And you might ask why he has to go on this great journey to rediscover the way. In fact, it's underlined because Virgil shows up right in the first canto and explains to Dante that he has been sent to guide Dante by Beatrice, by St. Lucy, and by the Virgin Mary, no less, as well. And yet he can't make any shortcuts to heaven where they are and where they're calling him. He must make the descent. You can see there, I hope, the gate of hell in the woodcut in the right-hand image where it says per me, through me, up purgatory into paradise. He must make this journey because this isn't just another day where he can sort of get on with his daily life with a bit of religious consolation. This is the day in which his full transformation is going to begin. And that's why the descent and the ascent are part and parcel of this journey. He must see, you might say, how he's limited, understand that, in order to see how he can change, understand that, to be able to experience all that he might be in his transhumanizing without loss of himself. If he had been rushed straight to paradise, I suspect it would have been at the cost of his consciousness. He wouldn't have been able to appreciate it for himself, and so would have had to lose himself in order to appreciate the divine. I mean, this is an experience that people have. They have a tremendous peak experience and then can wrestle for years trying to integrate it, not lose it, make it part of their life. And so I think that explains why Dante, even though he sees the light right at the beginning of the journey, has to undergo the journey. So turning to the journey and thinking first of all of this theme of love. The first point I wanted to touch on was when he meets Francesca and Paolo in the fairly high circles of hell. This is fairly early on his journey. It's one of the famous encounters from the Inferno. And here he meets couples who are whirling around in the winds of lust, having, you might say, fallen in love with love, rather than realizing that love is an awakening that can take you somewhere. In fact, can take you all the way to the divine vision. And so in this infernal state, love is experienced as much as a torment as it is a hope. You feel you need to cling on to your lover because if you lose them, you'll lose everything. You believe myths like there's a perfect person out there for you who, if only you could discover them, would complete your life, which is one way of summarizing what happened to Francesca and Paolo, the characters that he meets. And as Blake shows in this image here, Dante collapses at this moment in the Inferno. It's too much for him. He's realizing, I think, that this is what he thought love was about, particularly in the figure of Beatrice, who he is going to meet later. He had fallen in love with her, gripped by an infatuation, struggled all his mortal life to move on from that love and realize it was just the starting point for his journey in love. And so he sees that face to face at this moment in the Inferno and experiences how he doesn't understand love any better and collapses in a dead faint. Dante, the poet, tells us, as he did on the journey himself. it changes in a very pivotal moment in the purgatory. So this is a sort of second position where he starts to know love very, very differently. And it comes during the first night of purgatory when he has a dream. And in this dream, which is shown by the image on the left here, he sees love as a kind of rape, a kind of violent possession. What he dreams is of Jupiter appearing as an eagle and snatching the beautiful youth Ganymede to stand by his throne on Mount Olympus. And Dante wakes up and he's deeply disturbed by this dream. He realizes that when you have a dream, it comes from your psyche, no one else's, and so reflects what's going on in your psyche. And so he sees now his love in its possessive form, but he hasn't collapsed in a dead faint. He's now able to start to understand how he'd misunderstood love in its possessive, romantic, lustful guise. And this is stressed because when he comes around from his dream, even though he's disturbed, Virgil tells him that something else had happened during the night, that actually one of the beautiful women in heaven who were on the lookout for him, St. Lucy, she had appeared beside them and carried him up some of the way up the mountain. So love isn't possessive, he sees, even though that is the mode of love that's dominated his life. It's actually generous and wants to take you somewhere. It wants to hold you, but not so as to possess you, but so as to lift you. And I think this gives a key to how love can be transformed in our own lives, that when we can hold both the negative experiences of love, the way that it makes us panic, alongside the positive possibilities of love, the way that it invites us into more, that is what it is to begin to know love as taking us into the divine life. And Dante wrestles with this on Mount Purgatory, not least by having these two images now in his mind. And he must tolerate, you might say, the negative manifestations of what he thought about love before, in order that it can give way to the fuller divine experience of love, which can be not just his aid, but the energy that will take him into the divine realms. And then thirdly, when he's in the paradise, this is when he knows love in its fullest possibility. I've shown here this image by Doré, where Dante and Beatrice, now they're standing in the foreground, see the Empyrean, the domain of the divine unalloyed outside of space and time. And I've shown this image of the wonderful hierarchies of the angels, because I think the angels are the creatures that know the love of God and the intelligence of the divine in one seamless whole. That is what love brings us to. It's the desire to know all, to know more, to know God, but in a way that we keep our minds about it as well, and so can consciously ride this energy of love into the divine life. The angels do it because they're made that way. We do it because we're invited to become that way, and so share in the divine life in a different way from the angels. But when the angels, these living, pulsing, transmitting, channeling intelligences who delight in the light of God, when Dante starts to be able to see the angels, he knows that he's relating to love in the right way. He can have a mind about it now, participate in love fully. And I don't know whether there's any people who have seen angels listening this evening, but when we start to see more and more of the inside of life and realize not just its beauty and desirability, but maybe its intricacy, its nuance, its intelligence, that is another indicator for us that we're starting to be able to see, as Dante saw, using this energy of love in a completely transformed way. So there's something about love, from possessiveness through transport to participation, you might say. The ways that we can understand and almost monitor how our experience of love in our lives is changing or is not. An indicator, I hope, of the wonderful practicality of the Divine Comedy, as much as everything else it brings. So let me now say something about seeking, the related matter of going on this spiritual journey, undertaking this quest. And again, picking up on three moments, one from the Inferno, one from the Purgatory, and the third from the Paradise, to indicate how seeking transforms as well. The image now is one of William Blake's in a famous moment before the city of Dis in the Inferno. It's one of the kind of threshold moments in the Inferno where the tension, the drama, the suffering, the evil steps up. But it's a moment where Virgil thought he knew what to do. They approach the city gate and Virgil thought he knew how to open the gate, but he doesn't. And they have to wait for an angel to appear to open the gate for them. And I think what this shows is that Virgil is in a seeking mode where he thinks of things as a kind of puzzle, almost magically, as if just the right words will open the gate up and so they can continue on their journey. And he learns that there's some value in that. He actually tells Dante that he's been before the city of Dis before, and then his magic words did open up the castle and he could step through. But this time they haven't. And I think Virgil, as much as Dante, is being invited to learn something more about seeking. This is about his transformation, I think, as much as Dante's. And they learn a little bit more when they reach Mount Purgatory. And you'll know that in Purgatory, on the terraces, they encounter figures who are suffering, but suffering in a way that brings about their transformation. They're not stuck. They are looking at who they are, bearing all their failures and things like the possessiveness of their love, in order that their seeking can become focused primarily on their own personal transformation. They're moving from magic to dynamism, primarily the know thyself inner kind of dynamism. And that means that they can become more and more aware of reality. And so reality opens up more and more to them. This particular image shows the figures they meet on the terrace where people are wrestling with their pride. And they are bowed down by the weight of their pride, seen as great rocks. But they have hope here because they know that if they can understand their pride, it can transform from, you might say, vainglory, the pride that makes us think that we live in an isolated world which we rule ourselves and are in full control of, to the kind of pride that's dignity, that can stand up ultimately before the divine, knowing the ways in which we can share in the divine life. But vainglory and dignity and pride is a subtle business inside us. It can readily slip from one form to the other. And so that's what these figures are engaging with in their seeking. They're having to perceive more and more of themselves, understand the nuances of their inner lives in order that they can be more and more capable of sharing the inner life of reality itself. But seeking, nonetheless, in Purgatory has moved from a kind of puzzle to try and understand to a personal transformation that is expansive of the soul. And then thirdly, in Paradise, seeking goes on. It's one of the wonderful things about Dante and the Paradise is that the journey doesn't stop at the beginning of the Paradise as if suddenly it's just a kind of blissful ecstasy thereon in. The journey continues. In fact, in some ways, it's just the beginning of the journey, but it's now a journey into the infinite. And Dante's seeking marks that, because what his seeking largely or often involves now in the Paradise is his capacity to celebrate all that he can see, all that he can understand, all that has transformed for him. And he does this here when he meets the apostles Peter, James, and John, and they ask him to celebrate the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love, which with some experiment. Dante shows that he can. And so Blake here in this wonderful image shows the light and life that whirls around them as Dante shows that he can celebrate these qualities of existence, these qualities of reality. And because his seeking now is as much about celebration as anything. The knowing, the intellectual as well as loving celebration, that means he can articulate and show that he can reflect and radiate the qualities as much as enjoy them. So there's a second way in which Dante's Divine Comedy suggests to us how we can move through these realms of reality. When we think about the way in which we seek, does it seem primarily like a puzzle? Does it seem primarily about our personal transformation that opens up onto reality? And do we have moments where we feel we can celebrate and be at one with the reality that is opened up to us, as Dante discovers in the Paradise? Come to my third area and think about suffering. Now, suffering is really key, I think, partly because it's such a huge question for we humans, particularly those on the spiritual path, where it can either be very difficult to understand suffering, or there can be the desire to bypass suffering. The key reason why Dante has to travel through the Inferno up Mount Purgatory before Paradise is that suffering is part of this journey. It has got something to show us. But, you know, when you're talking about suffering, one always does it cautiously, because suffering really is suffering. And it can crush people. And when we are suffering, we can easily lose the divine vision and not know how to hold on to it. And this is what happens in the Inferno. Here's a scene where Dante is now inside the city of Dis, and he meets a couple of characters. Farinata, you can see rising out of the tomb in particular. And Dante's suffering starts to really escalate at this point. Farinata teases Dante, taunts Dante, reminds Dante that he's going to spend the last 20 years of his life in exile, which is when he writes the Divine Comedy. And this is not just an inconvenience for Dante, as if he could never come back to his home city, but could set up somewhere else. The Italian peninsula was in a state of civil war. To move into a different city-state was as much as moving into a different country. And particularly for Dante the poet, it meant that his natural language, with all its inflections and beauty that he was already a master of, would be increasingly useless because people spoke different dialects at the time. It was partly through Dante that Italian became a unified language. And so exile is real suffering. He loses everything when he can't return to Florence. And Farinata taunts him about his suffering in the Inferno. And Dante starts to think, is there no way out of this suffering? That changes on Mount Purgatory, the second phase. And here he learns to lean into suffering, realizing that combined to this self-transformation, suffering actually is a key indicator of the way he must go. This is an image of Dante on another one of the terraces, where he must step through flames in order particularly to understand his own desires, his own motivations. And suffering's involved in this because we human beings are very capable of creating a sense of ourselves where we feel we've understood something, we feel we've mastered something, that we can control something. And it actually cuts us off from reality. But because we feel we want to stay in control, letting go of that control is very anxious making. It provokes a lot of concern because we've got to step into something we don't understand. But Dante has realized by this point that stepping into what he doesn't understand through the flames that will burn away his self-control and other things means that he can step further towards paradise, as he does on the other side of the flames. And so suffering now has this quality of hope and also can be a guide to him. It's an indicator of the way he must take. And, you know, I hope that you've had that experience of suffering, how when it doesn't ease, it starts to become something that's trying to communicate a direction of travel for you. And so leaning into suffering starts to transform the experience of suffering as well as your sense of yourself, and brings this expansive quality in, which is what happens in the paradise. But what's so interesting is that he still sort of suffers in paradise. I think it's not quite the right word. It's more like now he must wrestle and struggle. And this image here shows him the moment in the paradise where he is being told that he will indeed have to go into exile for the last 20 years of his life. There's no way around that. He'll be pushed out of Florence and be in strange towns on his own. And when Dante hears about this in the paradise, he first of all tries to weigh up the good and the bad. He says to Beatrice, well, look, there'll be bad days, but there'll be good days as well, because I will find some hospitality as much as I'll miss Florence. And Beatrice says to him, no, that's not the paradisal way. Rather, it's to find the deeper sense of reality that can say yes to whatever happens, whether it's good or bad. What you must know here in order to move further and more intimately into the divine life is the kind of wrestling beyond good and evil and knowing the steady presence, which you might call the ground of your being, which whilst it knows about struggle and suffering and can say yes to whatever happens, also keeps a mind about what's happening, and so can be part of this continual journey into the infinite. Suffering has moved from being taunt and torture through being a difficult but recognizably necessary guide to the capacity more and more to step outside of that which produces not just suffering, but also happiness in the sense of being a kind of peak experience and up and down, to the steady presence of the divine that can embrace and contain the whole of life. And so in some ways moves beyond good and evil. That's how suffering changes for him in the paradise. An indicator too for us as to how suffering is not necessarily to be avoided. I say necessarily because of course there are some kinds of suffering which are unnecessary and things can be done about, but particularly this inner suffering that's really our own making, and if we don't address it, our unmaking. Dante is thinking a lot about that at this point in the paradise and how it can become part of this journey into paradise. That's the third area I particularly wanted to touch on this evening. Let me move to a fourth, and to bring in some sense of what we would now call the supernatural elements, and think particularly about the role of telepathy in the Divine Comedy. In the Inferno, there is very little, if any, sharing of minds. People struggle to communicate through language, let alone through anything subtler than that. And I show this image here of Capaneus, one of the figures they encounter, and he barely even sees that Dante and Virgil are there. He has very little understanding of his predicament in spite of its obvious torments. And so he's locked, you might say, in his own mind. He not only can't perceive the divine mind and is completely deluded about that, but he can barely speak to anyone else as well. And so this is telling us that communication is deeply linked with openness, not just to ourselves and others, but to wider reality. And that possibility starts to open up very clearly in purgatory, where people start to realize that they can know their own mind more in their transformation. They can experience the minds of others who are sharing this reality and begin therefore to share in the divine mind as well. and intimations of telepathy become possible, which I think is a really interesting idea about telepathy. Dante's saying that it's not actually a kind of one mind to another mind communication. It's actually about two minds sharing in the divine mind that then opens up others and reality in this intimate way as well. And this image here, another one of Dore's, shows the moment they meet a woman called Pia, and she asks Dante for his prayers and offers to pray for him, because I think prayer is a kind of intermediary stage between knowing the divine mind and all minds completely transparently, as happens in the paradise, and the cut off state of mind in hell. Prayer is the practice, if you like, where we open our minds to ourselves, invite the minds of others to share in our inner life, and of course, ultimately the mind of God to participate, commingle, start to percolate and change our own minds through a kind of divine triangulated telepathy, you might say. The more Dante suggests that we share in the one reality, the more we can share in the many reflections of that reality, not least in other human minds. And this happens in the paradise, where particularly Beatrice, who is now his guide, completely understands what's going on in Dante's mind, and particularly through looking into each other's eyes, as Botticelli shows here in one of his wonderful images, is able to kind of titrate into Dante's mind what he needs in this particular moment, so that his love, his intellect, his transformation can embrace the reality that's opening up before him at the many points in paradise where this happens. And as that happens, Dante starts to see that Beatrice is actually just titrating more and more of the divine mind into his mind through hers. And so he's becoming more and more able through this telepathic process to share in the one mind. Very interesting theory of telepathy to wrestle with here on Earth, but also another way of thinking about our own transformation and perceptual change in particular, as Dante shows us in the Divine Comedy. And so last of all, I wanted to touch on this business of transhumanizing. It's the word that Dante coins to explain in the paradise the full experience of divine reality that opens up to him, with all its sharing, all its commingling, all its still unfolding through this completely transformed suffering, but nonetheless always enjoying the desire now because it's met, always enjoying the questions because they're answered, always enjoying the struggle within himself because he knows that he's moving more and more into the divine life in that very struggle. And in the Inferno, to touch on that for the last time this evening, we have many encounters where this isn't possible, this transhumanizing isn't possible. And I wanted particularly just to flag up the moment where he meets the character of Bruno Latini in the Inferno, as you can see here with another one of Dore's wonderful images. And the interesting thing about Bruno is that he can talk a bit about what it is to transhumanize, but repeatedly gets it wrong. So for example, he knows, like Dante, what it is to be a great poet. Bruno is thought to be one of Dante's teachers. And yet he gets confused about his own glory and the divine glory he's trying to write about, and so gets stuck in an infernal state. Or at another moment, he says to Dante, follow the stars, follow your stars. But he's got confused because he's got stuck in the idea that the stars, the constellations, are speaking of his own life separately from the divine life. And so whilst he can say the right things to Dante about sharing in the divine glory, about following the journey to the stars, he's not fully understood them himself. And so they kind of backfire. And instead of transhumanizing, he's stuck in his own humanity. That's what the things that comes across as Dante and Bruno Latini talk in this very interesting section of the Inferno. But it changes, and it's changing particularly in the Purgatorio. No more dramatically in the moment where he actually meets Beatrice. This is actually at the tail end of the Purgatorio, before the Paradiso. And the remarkable thing about the encounter with Beatrice is that it's almost tortuous for Dante. He is not welcomed into her arms in a great kind of reunion of love. She chastises him, mercilessly for 2 cantos, in fact, which when you're reading the poem, it feels like a long time. And what she is telling him, I think, is that he must understand now that the love which he has for her, and indeed the love which she has for him, isn't just about the 2 of them. It's about opening onto divine reality itself. And so he must let go of her as the object of his desire in order to discover the subjectivity which is the source as well as the destiny of all our desires within us, within all things, and as the very source of reality itself. And so this chastising is a kind of separating that enables him, as he begins the transhumanizing process, to make the right links, the right joining, the right connections that will lead him into the stars, as Bruno Latini had half told him as well. It's very interesting, this moment of separation, even when you know you're on the journey. It happens in a number of spiritual traditions. If you think of the resurrection account, say in the Gospels, where the one where Mary Magdalene meets Jesus in the garden and presumes him to be the gardener. And then when Jesus says, I'm Jesus, she tries to touch him, and Jesus says, do not touch me. Noli me tangere, as it's often remarked in the art of this moment. And I think this is Jesus doing the same thing, saying, no longer cling to me. This is about us now together, knowing the God who is Father of us all. Another quite well-known moment in spiritual traditions is when Rumi meets Shams again, his great guide and mentor, and then Shams disappears without ever explaining to Rumi ever again the nature of his disappearance. And Rumi writes about this and how much a torturous, suffering time it was for him, until I think he understands that Shams was saying to him, no, I'm no longer the object of your desire. I'm no longer even going to transmit the object of our desires shared together. Now you must undergo the transhumanizing process that will lead you to the divine. So Dante experiences this in Purgatory, a kind of second phase of his transhumanizing, which then manifests fully in the paradise. And just wanted to show you 2 or 3 steps to bring my talk to a close about how that happens. His first glimpse of the divine, full-on, unalloyed, shown here in this wonderful image by Giovanni di Paolo, one of the great medieval illustrators of the Divine Comedy, is of the divine as an infinitesimally small source of infinite light. It's like a glimpse, that at first he has to see in the reflection of Beatrice's eye, and then he can turn and look at it himself. He knows he's going to see the divine now and become part of this participative vision. Another really wonderful moment where this is unpacked by Dante the poet for us as readers, as he explains he's now seeing the divine as himself an image or reflection of the divine, but knowing himself to be celebrating, enjoying the divine source, that his image is starting to become a perfect image. It's one of the moments where Dante's showing us this is actually a non-dual vision of the journey to the divine. And he talks about it was like seeing a mountain reflected in a perfectly still lake. And the more you look at this scene, the more you realize that the source and the image, the mountain and its reflection, are in a mutual dance of delight, in the image, in the source, so that when you look on it, you begin to wonder which is the image and which is the source. Such is the joining together, and a new thing is seen with the image that is participating fully now in the divine life. I think this is Dante indicating to us why there's such a thing as creation, why there are beings like us at all, that we are invited to share in the divine life in such a way that it amplifies and rejoices and celebrates it even more. But of course, there's always more already in the infinite life. So we're now participating in the infinite life fully too. There's also a very fascinating moment of emptying that happens in these final stages of his transhumanizing, shown here in Botticelli's image, where the figures of Dante and Beatrice are almost in a kind of empty space. This is the moment where Dante must let go of all that he is, knowing all that he is, but that knowing of himself is what's created the space into which the divine fullness can flow. And so it's this very wonderful sense of emptiness that you find in spiritual traditions represented by Dante, where, as his near contemporary Meister Eckhart puts it, we must become nothing if we're to know everything, because that nothingness isn't the empty void of the inferno now. It's not even the place which can be the site of our transformation, as he knew in the purgatory, but is already the fullness of the divine realization within us. Dante engages with that in the very last stages of his journey, until finally, in the last moments, as is shown here by Blake's contemporary John Flack, he knows himself to be spinning like a perfect wheel with the sun, with the love that turns the sun and the other stars. And Dante is amazed before he finally falls silent, as his words must, to give way to the fullness of this vision. He's amazed to see that the human life and the divine life already was all along one life, one light, one love, one intelligence, one participation. And so he understands that when he awoke in the dark woods midway through the course of his life, having wandered from the path, it was, if nothing else, the mistaken perception he had of reality that had caused him to be in the dark wood, which is now fully restored as he knows himself to be sharing completely, without any reservation, but with full celebration in the divine life. I would go for one of the ones in Penguin Classics, the one by Mark Muser. So it's cheaply, readily available in Penguin Classics. Mark Muser, I'll just write that in the chat. It's a good one because it keeps the tercet form, the pattern of the poetry, but doesn't try and do the rhyming, which is so much harder in English than in Italian. And it's a translation that is sort of as transparent as possible without losing the richness at the same time. And he also has very good level of notes that unpack things for you. So I recommend the Mark Muser one, and then you'll quickly want to get in another translation in English, if English is your language, that then you can compare and contrast, and that really then gets going this unpacking of the Divine Comedy that is so tremendous and wonderful. I think that intuition is correct, that being able to say yes to your life, the whole of your life, maybe in Nietzsche's sense, it's more that you therefore won't hate your life or wish you didn't have part of it. And so it's being able to say yes to the whole of your mortal life. And then maybe in the Buddhist sense, it takes on a slightly different inflection too, because then it's not just about being able to say yes to yourself in your own life, but is about being able to say yes to the transient, ever unfolding nature of life. And so being a release from suffering in that way. And then of course, Dante gives that yes the theistic inflection, which you'd find, say, in Advaita traditions, Sufi traditions, where you know that the yes is saying yes to the whole of divine life, because of course God says yes to the whole of life. In the theistic understanding, everything is in the divine life because the divine life is being itself. And so if anything were to fall outside of divine life, it would just drop out of existence altogether. You remember Dante in the Inferno meets Lucifer, who's right on the cusp of just about to fall out of being, but hasn't quite. And so I think another thing that Dante shows is how this vision is universal, that all will be saved. Every creature and thing will return to the divine life, because it's, even in extremis, still held in the divine being. But if you can say this yes, that is the crucial part of the beginnings of your return. Yes, I'm glad to say, because I try and weave together both the kind of narrative accounts using a lot of illustrations as well, such as we've seen this evening, as well as a kind of commentary unpacking too. So you can read my book standalone, but also use it as a way of trying to get into each canto by canto as well. My book's 100 chapters for the 100 cantos of the Divine Comedy. It's a very crucial question, not just because maybe now 700 years on we're that more alert to other religions and so wouldn't immediately demonize them, but also I think because what we perceive as demonic is really important for us to recognize, and because we might be massively mistaken. And I think that this moment in the Divine Comedy where Dante perceives Muhammad, if I can put it like that, and Ali, Muhammad's cousin, in one of the lower circles of the Inferno, is a moment where he starts to realize that he's seeing what he thinks should be here as much as what actually is here. And my justification for that isn't just because I find it difficult to tolerate the idea that Muhammad is where Dante seems to want to put him. I'm quite sure that's not the case. And Dante's pretty clear that's not actually the case too, because he actually, in purgatory and the paradise, sees other Muslims, and in particular in the paradise meets a chap called Sigar of Brabant, whom Thomas Aquinas, one of the great lights for Dante and indeed in Dante's paradise, had declared a heretic on earth, but they're both in paradise conversing about the divine light. So Dante later indicates to us that what he saw in the Inferno was profoundly mistaken. And the clue he gives us as to understanding that is that in the same canto, the same circle where he sees this Muhammad figure, is also where he sees a figure called Bertrand de Born. And he's another one of the famous figures of the Inferno, because he's decapitated and is holding his head by its hair as if it's a lantern. And I think what Dante, the poet, is telling us that Dante the Pilgrim, started to realize in that moment was that another way of putting the infernal state of mind is when you see only by your own light. You can't let in the divine light. It's the circle, you might say, of the fundamentalists, the literalists of religion. And he's showing that he has a side of himself which was literalist about Islam. And he was confronted with that when he thinks he sees Muhammad in the Inferno, and underlines that by figures like Bertrand de Born seeing by his own lights, quite literally there as well. And so, although it's difficult to read, it has the benefit that it makes us think about what is difficult for us in this journey, because we must face all the difficulties. We must make the descent before we can really fully and openly make the ascent, but with understanding that emerges because we face the difficulties. And so that's the way that I understand Dante's seeming placing of the prophet in the Inferno. He's reflecting on himself, and I think shows that even in his own terms, let alone for us 700 years later, by the fact that there are other figures following Muhammad's light in the paradise. Dante, the Divine Comedy was a huge success almost from the word go. It was copied, it was illustrated, read, both out loud as well as privately. So it was definitely a guide for people. And I think what Dante understood, and this is why I'm borrowing a bit from Owen Barfield as well, is that consciousness evolves, it shifts, our sense of who we are changes over time. And I think this is why he uses the word modern for the first time. He realized that what we now call the old medieval understanding was giving way for various reasons into what we now call the modern period, not least because of Dante himself. He's contemporary with figures like Giotto, you know, the Renaissance artist who start painting portraits of individuals rather than just stylized saints, for example. And so a new sense of being an individual was opening, which meant that the stress on the individual journey as a process of self-transformation and expanding perception, participating more and more consciously in the divine life was becoming the key element. And I mean, just to take the Book of the Dead from Egyptian times, I'm not fully conversant with that, but I've read a fair amount about it actually, and it always strikes me how participation in the divine life described in the Book of the Dead is very different. So, for example, take the famous moment of the weighing of the heart on the scales of justice, and what's so striking about that is that if your heart doesn't balance the feather, that's when you get eaten by the crocodile god. And so it's balance that matters in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And I think that's what this is saying, is that you mustn't stand out against the background mat. You must harmonize completely with it. And it's not therefore a vision of the afterlife that stresses the individual transformation. It's almost the individual merger with the divine life that's crucial. And you'll also know that the Egyptian Book of the Dead is full of spells and the words that you must know to open up the various gates, to take you through the various stages. And so that is much more a stress on knowledge given you by the gods, rather than a kind of cooperation with the gods, where this insight and love opens up within you as much as it's given to you by reality, Dante's perception of things. And so this is to say that it's a very different experience of the journey into the afterlife. One, I think, in Dante's case, that makes more sense to us now, as undoubtedly, because it existed for many millennia, the Book of the Dead made sense to the Egyptian consciousness, which I think was before a sense of being an individual as we experience it now. You know, Barfield's account of this I find very persuasive, that you knew yourself in the ancient world by the way that you shared in the many lives round and about you. So it's a polytheistic universe. Whereas in the modern post-Renaissance period, particularly, we must know ourselves as sharing in the divine life, first as an individual, and it then from that point that we can share more broadly with the life that is all things. It's a different kind of dynamic now. And Dante, I think, addresses that very consciously. I mean, one way of answering this is that I found the Divine Comedy opening up to me through my own analysis. I had quite a traditional analysis, and you know, many times a week for quite a few years, and that was very good at the descent bit. But when I wanted to start to work out how to climb out of this darkness that had been so powerfully opened up to me, it was in conjunction with the Divine Comedy that I started to be able to work that out, you know, with my analyst. And it's no surprise, therefore, that the Divine Comedy was very powerful for figures like Agesioli, one of Freud's followers, that's now in the tradition called psychosynthesis. It is definitely resonant with psychoanalytic traditions. I think that in terms of following Christ, what's so interesting is that Christ himself is sort of everywhere present, but often quite absent too in the Divine Comedy. And Dante actually only sees Jesus on a handful of times right at the top in paradise. And that's not to say that the presence of Christ isn't felt everywhere, but the direct vision of this figure is relatively rare. the person, of course, who is much more present is Beatrice and Virgil. And I think what Dante's saying to us is that we must identify who are our guides reflecting the Christic light, so to use the Christian image, reflecting the divine light in the here and now. You know, this stress on the importance of the now, because that's the moment of change. That's the moment of being able to drop vertically into being rather than being trapped horizontally in timed being. So it's as much a critique, I think, of Christianity as known in his time, and I think quite widely even now, which treats the journey as if it's somehow imitating Christ, or thinking that Christ has done all the work and all we need to do is say yes to the work that's been done for us. No, it's, as St. Paul puts it, it's working out our own salvation, cooperating with the grace that is flowing around and about us. And so whilst the journey mirrors the Easter weekend and then into Easter week too, it's not in any way just a rehearsal of that. In some ways, quite surprisingly different, because, say, his guides are Virgil and Beatrice, not Jesus directly. Thanks for that. Look, thanks for hosting this. I love Watkins' books, and it's a joy to contribute to all you do as well, and have the chance to speak about these things, because as we all know, it's when we share and speak about them that they become more real to us as well. So thank you for that. And I have a website, markvernon.com, where I try and keep future events, podcasts. I do quite a lot of YouTubing, talks, gatherings, which I host myself online as well. I try and put all that there. So markvernon.com is the place to go. Cheers for now.